Hello, hello. My name is Eddie Adams, and this is the 3-hour process video for how I took an idea and turned it into a final artwork. Pretty much nothing was skipped or edited out, except little bits of research or tutorials I had to do along the way. But really, this is an uncut, somewhat unedited version of the entire process, so I hope you learn a little bit or a lot and get something out of it. So thanks, and let's just dive right in. Here I am getting started building a figure for the scene. This way I know the scale of everything and everything kind of fits together better. And here, just working more on blocking out the scene, I'm using Google Maps and Google Earth to get a sense of a natural topology. And before getting too deep into details, I just wanted to lay things out and kind of get a sense of scale. And by starting with a real-world scale, everything, at least in the beginning, is theoretically accurate. And that doesn't mean the composition will work perfectly, but at least you're starting somewhere real. And so in this initial build-out, blocking and speed is way more important than spending any detail or any time on detail. And in cinema, there's a lot of pre-built assets. There's some trees, some buildings, even, props, trash cans, and that sort of thing. And so really quickly, you can not only see what a cube looks like in the scene, but see what an entire 2-story house looks like. So that way it helps you position the camera and see how big or how small certain things are appearing. Like right now, the house is pretty large compared to the figure. And the purpose of the story is to show off this figure's decision making. And so later on, we'll see how this scene kind of evolves and how these pieces slowly evolve to fit together. Like here, you can see I moved the figure to the other side because the sense of pull was functioning a little bit better going into the forest rather than having just left the house. And here I'm still just throwing down assets, really spending the time to lay things out without investing too much on any one thing. Like building the car would take hours, even days, so just starting with rough assets can be a real time saver because maybe in the end you don't even need a car. So here I am in Daz. It's kind of a interesting looking boy, but I was able to find a plugin or a little package for Daz 3D that has different age settings, and so I wanted to have a younger boy be the main character because he has a sense of innocence. And so with this plugin in Daz, there's just like a preset proportion for the entire body, so I wouldn't have to, cross-check images and do too much work getting that figure's proportions right. And because it's still based on the normal Daz, and it's like the Genesis model, all of the pre-built animations and poses still work, even though the size of the character is a lot smaller. And so here, I knew I wanted the boy holding a torch and a spear, and at first I wanted him walking into the forest, and so I was able to position him in Daz, but also save the entire animation so that eventually in Marvelous Designer here, the clothing can be built on a T-pose and then simulated to the final position. And in Daz, thankfully, there's a lot of pre-built patterns that you can find online that are good for pants or jackets or T-shirts, because it's pretty difficult just to guess what or how pants are made, and where the cuts are in the seams, and how things fit. And even with the pattern, the pants don't really fit right away, and so you have to kind of adjust things as you go and see how the fabric falls. And with Marvelous Designer, I'm not too experienced, so a lot of this is just trial and error and seeing where things got bunched up. And thankfully, in Marvelous now, you can do a lot of the editing in the 3D window. So if certain things aren't stitched right, you can adjust that in the 3D space rather than having to go over to the 2D window and kind of guesstimate where things are lining up. And for this whole time lapse, I didn't want to edit too much out because I wanted to show the entire process. So some of these sections might run a little bit long because I'm just trying to figure out what's going on even. And so here, this is the animation portion of Marvelous Designer. This lets you take a T-posed character, or any animated figure really, and it lets you build all your stuff in the T-pose, and as it animates, it simulates the wrinkles and the physics of the fabric. And so, in theory, you can render or capture the entire sequence of frames, but in this case, I only need a still, so I'm just worried about that final frame where the fabric lies. And here we're back in Cinema, everything exported out of Marvelous fine. I think I was just working with OBJs, so there wasn't too much to worry about. Another nice thing about Marvelous is that because everything is based on a 2D plane at first, all the UVs are super accurate because the UVs are flat and then the 3D model or the 3D fabric gets simulated. So UV unwrapping isn't necessarily anything you have to worry about. And there is UV tools in Marvelous Designer, so you can put more attention in certain areas if you need, more detail on a certain part of the mesh. And the way I approach this whole process is getting a lot of progress quickly and then really just jumping around to things that I felt I had the motivation and interest to go on. There wasn't a lot of rhyme or reason other than fast progress and, chunking things out before diving too deep. So here, because the buildings, these apartments or condos are so big in frame, I wanted to start blocking those out just to see how a modern apartment would feel versus the more traditional homes that I had in place before. And pretty quickly, I realized the right and left halves of the frame really divide the modern society versus the forest. And so these buildings in the background, I kept adjusting and kind of pushing to make sure there was a separation where the houses didn't bleed over into the forest's side of the frame. Because that way, the distinction between nature and society is very, very clear. Now that I did that, I'm back to the boy working on some of the props for him. The spear and the torch, which is definitely a nod to Zelda, which heavily influenced some of my design decisions with both the hero's journey and later I literally put a master sword in the scene that's pretty hidden in the final render, but you can still see it there. And again, still just blocking things out, so bending this tree. Tree wouldn't normally bend perfectly like that, but this is just a placeholder tree from the plugin Forester, so I'm not too worried about getting that just right. And here's build out of the cave, just using really basic shapes to get the general flow and shape of the cave in place. Again, knowing that I'll go back and find real rock assets to build it out more realistically. And here just starting to fill out some of the smaller details of the scene. And again, not making anything realistic or detailed, just finding what props I will need to make in the end. Because some of these temp assets ended up getting deleted before I even needed to do a final pass at it. So I saved a lot of time not going too deep into modeling or finding the perfect car model or the perfect tree models just yet. So here my idea was that the boy would have just come out of the house, and so the smoke from this, the torch would kind of slowly waft and show you his path. And in theory, I like the idea, but in the end, you'll see later on that simulating the smoke and having the smoke realistically have that trail didn't look very realistic based on the weather, because it's a rainy environment, and so the smoke wouldn't just linger that much. So here I am in Google Street View, which is a massively useful tool because instead of having to go out and collect reference, you can scoot around anywhere in the world and find, example fire hydrants or electrical boxes or garbage cans. And so really quickly you can get really great reference research. And here, now that I went through Google Street View, I captured a lot of details, but also some ideas, and I'm just jotting all that down from reference into an actionable list. And currently it's just in Google Docs, but later I'll shift that to Google Spreadsheets or Google Sheets, and eventually to, I think it's Airtable, which is similar to Sheets, but a little more user-friendly, looks nicer, and is really nice for building out shot lists. Now here I'm starting to get into color a little bit. Everything up until this point has been pretty grayscale other than the tree assets. But when you're in this phase of blocking, you want to start thinking about lighting and how the colors are going to play, because even though none of the textures are in there, you're still going to start seeing where the light falls, where the light bounces. And so thinking about that on the early end of the project is super important. And again, here I am in Google Street View finding what kind of light posts are used, what kind of telephone poles, making sure it's accurate, but it's also aesthetic. Because sometimes what's in reality isn't very interesting. Like this initial electrical pole is really basic, but in the end I wanted something a little bit more complex. Here's just blocking out some more assets. There's a mailbox there for the apartments. There's a little sewer drain. And at this phase, some of the stuff is getting a little bit more settled in. A lot of the pieces are feeling good. I can start seeing a little bit of the direction of the piece. It still looks like garbage, so I know there's a lot to go. And when you're at this phase, you realize, like, okay, we have to build a lot of stuff. And I wanted to build most of the things from scratch. I didn't want to use too many assets because this is an exercise in me getting better at modeling and building out this whole production process. And so I really wanted to rely as much as I could on myself. Some things like trees I'm not going to hand model, but for a lot of the other stuff I wanted to put that into practice. All right, so here you can see I'm taking my Google Doc, which is a pretty loose list of ideas and thoughts on the project, and I'm kind of transcribing them into a Google Sheets environment where I can track things better. I can categorize where there's a blocking section, modeling, texturing, lighting, all that kind of stuff. Because if you don't have a clear direction like this, you might just get sucked into one little detail, or you forget things. Like a lot of times I'll have an idea, I'll write it down, and I'll deep dive into something else, and I'll have totally forgotten that I wanted to add, fog in the background or whatever. And so having things laid out like this really makes it nice just to jump back in, see what you have to do, and it forces you to do the things you don't want to do, because sometimes there's a task that's difficult, but if you just challenge yourself to go top to bottom, you might actually, do the harder stuff first if it's higher on the list, even if you don't want to. And I think I jumped forward a little bit in the screen recording, but now you can see everything's color-coded. And eventually I make the layers in Cinema 4D match those color layers in my spreadsheet just to further keep things organized. And I think I think you can see that's what I'm doing now. I'm going through my object manager and naming, organizing, and just putting things in a place that makes more sense now that I have that spreadsheet built out. Okay, so there are the layers just built out. And it's nice to keep those layers color-coded in a very aesthetic way, because the default colors in Cinema 4D are a little too saturated, a little too contrasty. And so with just a little time, you can make a nice kind of soft palette of colors. So here I'm using a cross-section of a street to get the overall proportions and shape of the street somewhat accurate, because streets aren't perfectly flat, and I wanted to make sure when the rain is hitting that street, the reflections feel proper and they're not too perfect or too flat, and they're not reflecting things like a street wouldn't be reflecting. And by using a sweep for the street, it made things really easy to edit as I went, and I didn't bake down the street until much later in the project. And here I duplicated that street sweep out to start making the landscape. And again, the landscape doesn't need to be that realistic on the base mesh, because it's going to be completely covered with grass and trees and other foliage. And so I just needed the overall shape to be accurate and smooth, but still have a little bumpiness and a little, natural erosion. And the sculpting tools in Cinema 4D are sophisticated enough where you can quickly push and pull those things, and you don't have to manually do a lot of the modeling. You just sculpt a little bit. And there you can see I added checkboxes to the Google spreadsheet, and that way I can visually make little checks and see my progress and keep motivated, because as those check marks start building, you feel a sense of motivation and inertia, and so you can keep going a little bit easier when you have that history of your progress so visualized. So here I'm just building out the lawn in front of the condos on the left side. And the reason I wanted to get so specific in that shape is because this is where the grass would be spawned from. And so I wanted to make sure the detail was there, but there wasn't too much geometry that I would have to be dealing with. Because if you spawn a lot of objects on a huge mesh and then use selection tags to shrink it down, I think it often calculates everything and then deletes what you don't want. So it's nice to have a smaller mesh where you need the objects cloned the most, because it seems to speed up performance a little bit that way. And here, now that I have that terrain built out on the right, I'm able to sculpt the general shape of the cave and have it be a little bit better than just those spheres like it was before. Because that way I can see how the light falls and how the path right here that I'm making leads up to it, to make sure you can feel a little bit of sense of that space. Because I'm having a lot of layers of foreground, middle ground, and background, getting that sense of scale and that depth fall off was kind of challenging, because I wanted the boy to be larger in frame, but I wanted the camera angle to be long enough so things got compressed a little bit. And so in the end, I had to pull the boy quite a bit forward to make him big enough to be the hero in the frame and not just fall off into the background. And so here I start getting a little more detailed on the asset build out. Here's the sewer drain that I'm, pulling up a reference for. It's so easy to start building and not have a perfect reference in mind, but it's so important to have something to look at and keep referring to. Even having it up on screen at the same time is really helpful, because then you're not second guessing what to do. You just look at what you want to build and just do the best you can to replicate that. So for the great part of this, I was using splines and extrudes to get that shape, because hand modeling a shape like that would be really time consuming, wouldn't really make any sense. So keeping that with a lot of ingons wasn't too much of a concern. It's not going to be deformed, and when I UV, actually I don't know if I UV unwrap it. If I did, it still wouldn't be that big a deal to have an ingon like that. And yeah, for the backside of it there, I just did some simple box modeling. It's such a simple shape, I didn't need to get too elaborate with how I built that out. And for the manhole here, circular objects like this obviously require a lot of geometry to get smooth, and so I started with the full circle. Eventually, I'm going to chop this up and then mirror it, so all the efforts I'm spending here modeling this little indent won't have to be duplicated. I mean, I'll literally duplicate it rather than doing it multiple times. And even though this is going to be quite small in frame, I wanted to add enough detail so it caught the lights in the scene really well and had enough detail to get the textures looking nice and getting the dirt buildup and the bits of rust or wear. And it's always a challenge deciding how much effort to put into the model versus putting into the texture. Because for here, for instance, I have all this type and it's all 3D and it's all geometry. But we could probably get to a similar result in Substance Painter, where all that lettering is painted on, or it's designed in Photoshop and then used as a bump map and as a, like a mask. But sometimes, I know, it just depends what you're most comfortable in. Like for me, I knew I could bend the type around and have it fit perfectly in the shape. Rather than doing that in Substance, it might be a little tricky getting the type to bend just right. So there it looks like I finished modeling the sewer drain, the manhole. So here I'm starting to think about what the grass and the foliage is going to look like. So I jumped into Mega Scans and pulled a nice kind of basic grassy texture. And then using Forester, I was able to really quickly get all these nice grass clumps and dead grass clumps built out pretty much instantly, because it's already built for you. You just have to decide how much and how many. And Forester is great because there's a lot of options for how many segments you want on each blade of grass, or how bent or curled each thing is. Another tricky thing is this little patch, is only maybe 3 or 4 feet wide. And so performance is not an issue when you're at this scale. But when you blow this up to a scene that's almost an entire city block long, you really start worrying about the segment count, the blade count of each clump of grass, all that kind of stuff. So right here it might look really nice, but when you spread it out over an entire area, things get a little trickier. And a lot of stuff changed throughout this project. So, for instance, this patch of grass was going to be in front of the condos, because the idea was that the people in the condos are so focused on their televisions and their technology, they don't even have time to keep their grass alive and trimmed. But in the end, I decided that kind of foliage would make more sense in the forest, where it's more unkempt, and the city would still be very tidy, because I'm sure the people that own the condos, they might have a gardener, or they might, have their kid do it or whatever. So in the end, I made that side a little tidier still. So this street light, it's a pretty minor prop, but because it emits light and there's going to be a lot of fog in the scene, I wanted to make sure that there was enough detail that it would make sense if these 3 light rays were shot out of it and hit the street in a realistic way. And thankfully, the Ies Lights in Cinema and in Redshift are so realistic, and they throw light in such a nice way you don't have to worry about building your own light-emitting shapes or building weird little shades to block some of the light. You just get this really nice light throw automatically. I think for now, though, I'm just using a basic cone light or a spotlight to get the basic idea across. And again, a lot of these assets would be easily found online that were pre-built, but I really wanted to test myself and see how far I could get without having to rely on pre-built assets. And so much of 3D modeling is just finding the right reference and taking what you have in your head and making sure it actually exists, or it exists how you remember it. Because so often you think of something and you have a fuzzy image of what it actually looks like, but until you find reference, you're just relying on your memory, and memories are not at all accurate. So now I want to build a little shopping basket to be thrown into the forest to kind of signify that people are no longer going to stores, no longer shopping. No one leaves their houses. Everything's delivered to them. And so this shopping basket is just a very subtle way of, poking at that direction that society's going. And hopefully in this time lapse you can see some of the techniques I'm using. I'm not going to, deep dive into how to model this or that, but hopefully you can see the overall flow and get an idea how you would do this yourself. One thing I've found while modeling over the years is that the best thing you can do is simplify and plan as soon as possible. So if you're making a shopping basket, you only have to make a quarter of it, and then you symmetrize that twice. So you don't even start with a big shape. You often will start with a small piece and just use some smart techniques to save a lot of time. And so here the staff, I was again heavily influenced by Zelda for this and wanted to kind of give a nod to that. You'll notice that the little branch in the staff is going towards the trunk of the tree rather than towards the leaf side of the branch. But I think sometimes you don't have to have everything be perfectly realistic, and maybe the tree grew a little differently or whatever. Another fun thing about this whole process is that you learn how things work. Like, you might not necessarily know that a torch functions by wrapping, fabric or rope really tightly to hold all the fuel. So here I'm modeling basically exactly the Master Sword. And like I said before, this asset won't be extremely obvious in the scene. It's only shown in the reflection of the puddle in front of the boy. The boy's not actually going to be carrying the sword itself. And this was just a fun idea I had, that the reflection of the water was a reflection of what the boy felt in his head, not necessarily reality, but his imagination. And because it's going to be such a subtle prop, I didn't have to spend too much time making it super detailed or even unwrapping it. It just functioned well enough as a simple shape. Another great resource is unsplash.com. That's where I find a lot of my photo reference. And Unsplash is great because everything is shot from a real photographer and uploaded from real people and not just stock photographers. And so you get a lot more natural results. You get this broken down fence on a countryside. It's not some generic fence shot perfectly straight on or whatever. So you get just really nice, realistic reference and artistic. So here I'm building the fence that goes in front of the forest to kind of prevent people from getting in. And with Cinema 4D, it's really easy to make one thing and then duplicate it along a path or, out in space. And so it lets you really quickly prototype things without having to manually put things in places or, duplicate a bunch of stuff and take up a lot of memory. And for these pieces of wood, I just use a displacer with some noise to get a little roughness in them, knowing that eventually I would probably download a Plank asset that was photo scanned, so I wouldn't have to worry about unwrapping and spending all this time making it perfect if the asset already existed. And kind of ironically, I'm putting all this effort into this fence, and in the end, you're only going to see the first couple, sections of the fence. The rest of it falls back so far behind all the nature stuff that you don't even know it's there. So here I am in Megascan's Bridge, and Megascans is this great resource library where they go and physically take photos of all these assets, scan them, convert them into a PBR workflow. And so you get just beautiful diffuse textures, reflection, bump, all that. And in their later versions, they have an option where you can export it directly from Bridge to Cinema 4D, and you don't have to rebuild the materials or download stuff manually. So it saves a ton of time, because before you would download an asset, unpack it, rebuild it, and then bring it in. But now you just click a button and it brings it right into Cinema 4D. So here I'm just building a little caution tape that goes on the section of the fence that's broken down. And again, this kind of falls back on the idea that society is so afraid of what it doesn't understand that it puts up fences and walls to keep separation to what the people feel like is keeping them safe, but it's also preventing opportunity and preventing, exploration. And here I'm just doing some research and starting to build out a warning sign to further pull that point home that this kid is not supposed to be going in this area, but he kind of has to. It's his make or break moment. So here I'm just adjusting assets, kind of planning for what's going to come next. Sometimes you have to step back and see where you're at and see what makes the most sense to start on, because sometimes you'll build one thing and it affects the plans moving forward. So here I'm just kind of drilling down through all my reference, figuring out what to do or what I need to work on. I had already built a rough shape of these houses, but now I'm going back and spending more time detailing it out and using the reference a lot more specifically and thinking about where the railings are, where I'm going to add my edges for the textures that'll come on later. And this house for quite a while will be perfectly instanced to the other houses in the neighborhood until later I'll bake those down and customize them just a little bit so they're not perfectly identical. And again, still at this point, I'm really focusing on rough prototyping rather than detailing anything out too small. Like this rooftop railing will be pretty small in frame, but it is part of the silhouette of the house, and so there does need to be some level of detail in there. And some of these little shapes, these little cubes that are maybe electrical outlets, they may never have more detail than just a simple cube shape because they're so small in frame, and when the light falls on them, you'll understand that to be something, but you don't necessarily need to texture it accurately or add too much detail if it's going to be that small. And here I'm just building out the windows, making enough detail for the lights to fall into those little crevices. And now with these new buildings in place, the scene already looks a lot more realistic because you have a little bit more attention to those big details in the scene. You know, the houses take up a good portion of the space, and so being able to duplicate those and get those shapes in there, it makes the scene feel a little bit more complete pretty quickly. And here I found a pretty nice photo of a condo from maybe a drone shot. And so I was pulling some props from that photo and building those out. Just so from the ground level you can look up and see a little bit on the roof, so it's not just a blank roof, but people actually inhabit it. Yeah, a lot of these really simple props that you're seeing me build out will stay that way through the end of the process because some of them you don't even see in frame. They might be on the top of the roof and they're not large enough to show through, but sometimes it's good to build out those props just to make the space a little bit more complete, and maybe light will bounce on it in a certain way and it'll still get picked up even if you can't see it right away. Same with this prop. This like electrical utility meter thing, it's going to be on the far condo, and because it's going to be so far back in the shadows behind the air conditioner, I don't even know if you see it in the final scene, but still I wanted to build it out just in case light did hit it in a certain way, and just in case it was necessary to really sell that these are real houses, these are, you know, real people living in them. It's not just a model home that's empty on the inside. It's actually pretty fun modeling props that are going to be so far back because you don't have to worry too much about topology or making sure they're really well built. As long as the overall shapes are there and the materials work well on it, it functions just fine. And again, like having to research electrical boxes and if it's even necessary for a home to have one, and like a lot of these things I don't even know, but I kind of have an idea of in my head, and so I have to do some research. Like, okay, what are electrical boxes? Like, what do they do even? And so a lot of this is just a learning process, learning about real life so that you can emulate it properly. So here I'm just starting to think about how things are going to render. I have a moonlight that's just a directional light casting a hard shadow on things. The boy's torch has a point light kind of right in the middle of it to throw light on the boy, and in his environment you see some light on the fence as well, and in the trees. And for the condos, I wanted to make sure they felt lived in, so temporarily I made this orange bright material just to reflect on the ground, just to see how things would start looking. Because if all those lights were out in the houses, the balance of light and composition would be much different than if they were lit. So this kind of helped me see how things were laying out and seeing where these big pieces were falling into place. And here you can see I'm starting to work on the asphalt material for the street, because it falls so far into the foreground, a lot of the scene will be that chunk of asphalt that you see reflecting the scene. And here I'm starting to work on the front yards for the condos, detailing a little bit out where those grass pieces are going to be spawned from. And spawning grass and foliage is always so fun, because you take one little asset and you duplicate it out, and you really quickly get a nice lawn texture, or a lawn with thousands, millions of blades of grass. Here I'm just kind of organizing the scene layout and making sure everything's named properly and in the right places. And now that I'm using a really nice set of layers, I can hide certain layers so, all these trees and all the grass isn't bogging down the scene, because when a layer is hidden, it totally removes the calculations done. And so it can speed stuff up a lot more than just hiding an object or a null. And here, thankfully, I was able to find some schematics for a garbage can. And so I had a pretty good base to start modeling this off of. It's one of those things where I had the picture of a garbage can in my head, but then when I started modeling it, I realized it's a lot different than kind of the generic thing I had pictured. And it didn't really feel like it was coming together for quite a while, and in the end it turned out all right, but I know sometimes things don't look as good as you hope they do right away, and you just kind of have to keep working forward on it until it starts to come together. And sometimes things just end up a little janky, and you just throw some reflections on there and just hope for the best. Yeah, modeling's always tricky. It's not especially fun a lot of the time. Sometimes you have challenges on where to put the edge flow, or how to extrude something properly where the edges do flow well into the rest of the model and don't just get all bunched up. And I did a decent job on this. There are a few parts of the lid and where the lid hinge is attached that I definitely struggled with, but in the end, sometimes you just have to move forward and not belabor it too much, especially if it's not going to be deformed, or you don't have to worry too much about featuring the prop. And here I kind of modeled myself into a wall where I started building it out, and I thought that the lids were built a certain way, and they're actually built a little differently, where the bottom attaches and has a hinge in a certain way. So I had to go back and kind of shoehorn in the proper way to do it versus what I started building, which can be really frustrating because you might build something and then it's not working and you don't want to start over, so you just kind of force it to work and then you get something that's good enough. And that garbage can, because it's so far in the foreground, it was important to get that detailed out because, as you can already see, like that shape demands a lot of the attention in the foreground at least. But with lighting later on, I make sure to not pull too much attention to it, where it's definitely not the highlight, but it's an important detail. So here I'm starting to detail out the forest floor, getting some clovers and some ferns built out, and again using Forester to really quickly get to this pretty nice looking patch of forest floor with pretty minimal work. Here I'm back in Mega Scans looking for assets that I'll be able to use for the forest. Getting a nice ground texture to put everything on and then building on top of that. And here this is Quixel Mixer. This is another Mega Scans product, but this lets you take multiple different assets, blend them together, add layers of water or roughness, and kind of author your own materials that are still based on photo scans, but they're kind of your own, and they add another level of detail or uniqueness to the materials. And because it's raining in the scene, I had to consider that literally everything had to have a little bit of shininess or wetness. So here you can see I'm making sure everything's shiny enough and reflecting light a little bit more than they would if they were just totally dry. And again, here you can see how I took that little patch and had to expand it over the entire forest floor. And so what might work in this little patch that you're looking at from above might not function as well when you have this low angle looking across, because if you have a ton of ferns throughout the whole thing, you're not going to be able to see anything in the background. And so I really had to balance to make sure I wasn't overwhelming the scene with all that shrubbery. And here I have no idea what I'm doing yet. Okay, it looks like I'm starting to work on the road material. And because this is so far in the foreground, I had to pay a lot of attention to how this would look and how it would pick up light. And then even, building out the stripe on the street, it had to, curve along with the street. So it had to be, set up on the UVs properly and scaled properly. And that's one thing I had a lot of trouble with on this entire project was scale, because I wanted the boy to be very prominent. And so the size and position of him compared to the street, compared to all the buildings, was a little tricky. And in the end, the street, like right here, the street looks a lot smaller than it should be. Like a car would barely be able to fit in that current 2-lane road. So later on, I removed this yellow stripe and move it to the side and make it wide instead, so it's a little bit more of a wide 1-lane type of road rather than this split 2-way road. But at the time I didn't really realize that, and I didn't notice how small it felt, and so I continued building it this way for a while. And you can see my node structure getting pretty thick because I have the concrete or the asphalt on the bottom, and then I have this stripe that's layered on top, and it has to be masked properly. And so at this point, I'm merging, looks like 2 chunks of material. I think in the end I might add another chunk when I add a small detail to a section of the street. And here I think I'm looking for streets that have the striping that I'm looking for. Because again, I want to make sure I'm making it accurate and not just going off kind of what I picture in my head, because our memories tend to simplify things, and I wanted to make sure this was at least somewhat accurate to start. And here I'm building out the striping of the yellow stripes, making it so I didn't have to manually adjust the material itself or the textures, but had a gradient that would kind of automatically chop up that stripe into the different sections. Okay, so here I think this is where I downloaded a little Asphalt Patch from Megascans, and I wanted to place it in the scene so you could see a little bit of variation in the asphalt. It wasn't just this perfect, consistent, chunky asphalt, but there was bits of wear and tear, or in this case, a patch that had been freshly, asphalted over. So you can see already that it's starting to pick up light a little differently. It's a little bit more rough than the rest of the street, and so you can see that it's been maintained. It's a little bit more realistic that way. And because I was essentially compositing all these layers in Redshift, I had to build out a whole lot of different nodes and compositing nodes to layer them up. I think it's the material blender or material layer node is really helpful, because you can take full entire materials and composite them using alphas or masks. And here I'm experimenting with displacement, trying to get that little patch to be a little bit more elevated than the rest of the asphalt. So here's when things start to get a little bit more fun. I'm simulating the fire and the smoke for this torch using X particles. And X particles is really nice for some of the smaller scale simulation, because you can really quickly get something flaming, because in the newer versions of X particles, they have these tools, these presets that you select an object and click a button, and it automatically assigns the right tags. It assigns fuel and the heat and all the properties. And so you just click that and then set up the parameters that you want and keep adjusting the resolution, and you get some pretty sweet results pretty quickly. One thing that I found, though, with using X particles versus turbulence FD for this sort of simulation is that X particles does a really good job, but it's way slower than turbulence FD for at least the fluid simulation, like gaseous kinds of fluid. And so if I did this again, I might use turbulence FD for the fire and smoke rather than X particles, just because it works so much quicker and you can crank the resolution a lot more without getting hit so much in the performance. Yeah, so here I'm kind of struggling with X particles to get that smoke trail I was talking about earlier, where the boy's torch moved along this route, and as you can see, there's some stepping that's happening right now, which is easy enough to solve. But then, because the torch has to go so far with the smoke existing, that if it's too turbulent like this, most of the trail disappears, and so you don't get a sense of that, the kind of trail shape I was going for. So here I'm continuing to experiment, seeing how the turbulence and how the the speed of the simulation affects all of this. And it looks super cool, but it definitely doesn't look like a torch has been walked across a street by any means. And at this point, I don't even know if this idea makes sense or looks, or could look really good having that long of a trail on such a windy, rainy day. So you see here that the less that the smoke diffuses, the longer the trail becomes, but then you get this really weird kind of slithering line rather than this smoky trail like it is kind of right there. With particle simulation like this, it's all about trial and error. It's so hard to predict how things are going to react sometimes, and you do kind of get the hang of certain parameters, but every project's different. And like this one, because it's such a long, slender space, it's, tricky in different ways compared to other projects. So here I saved one frame of the simulation and brought it into the actual scene just to see how that might play into the overall composition of things. So on this one, the result turned out pretty good, but it still looks kind of funky. Like, smoke doesn't really react like that, and the smoke next to the flame is very simple and not very detailed. And so for now, I'm happy enough with it, but I think I end up coming back to this again and trying to get something a little bit sharper. And yeah, already I realize I'm not happy with the smoke, so I decide to jump back in and experiment a little bit more. With this idea, I was leaning a little bit more into the windiness of the scene because there is a pretty good headwind, because you can see the rain is pretty diagonal. And so I figured, well, maybe the smoke is being blown back quite a bit. Unfortunately, this was the wrong choice. Here I'm starting to understand a little bit more that the smoke is probably not going to be a full trail back to the house, but dissipating a little bit earlier instead. Here I'm going to give it a little test render to see how the smoke is holding up. And of course, I'm not happy with it, so I'm back into the simulation scene trying to get a good little smoke trail out of it. And here, instead of having the source of the smoke slide along that rail, I'm just having the torch burning and having the wind kind of carry it away. So instead of trying to force this big, long trail, now I'm just focusing more on getting a realistic smoke and fire simulation going. And as you can see, pretty quickly here, I'm getting something a lot nicer looking than what I was trying to force earlier. And because the overall box that the simulation is happening in is smaller, I'm able to crank the resolution more, so I get a lot more wispy detail in the smoke rather than stretching out the container to be really massive and requiring a little bit smaller of a resolution. So here I'm transitioning back to the boy. I made the decision that I didn't want him to be walking into the forest, but rather standing there deciding what to do. He still has the decision to take the first step forward or to turn back. And because he's not walking, it builds a little bit more of that tension of the choice. Like, he hasn't yet made the choice. And by doing this, of course, I have to resimulate the pants and do a little bit of rework on some of the stuff I've done before, but that's just, the cost of making adjustments like this. Luckily, I didn't have the jacket built out yet, so the effort wasn't too massive to switch that position. And now in Redshift, I'm starting to dial in the fire and smoke a little bit more, and with the environment hid, it actually looks pretty cool having just the boy in the fog with the fire. So here I am going back to resimulate the pants and get them on the normal upright boy rather than the walking boy. Now I'm starting to build out the rain boots for the boy. The initial inspiration to build this now is because if I brought this into Material Designer or Marvelous Designer, the boots would be able to hold the pants up. I think in the end I didn't bring the boots into Marvelous, but that was my thought process on starting to build these now. And here it's just a normal box modeling workflow. I'm not a modeler by trade, and so some of the techniques I'm using might not be the most efficient, but I'm able to brute force my way through it and get what I need in the end. And this asset was definitely one that I struggled with just because the proportion of the boy's foot compared to all the reference was a little bit different, and the shoes are not symmetrical in any one direction. Our feet have the big toe on one side that is larger than the other half of the foot, and so the overall shape of a shoe is pretty unique at every different surface. And so for quite a while in this process, it looked a little like a duck foot or a little lopsided. And so I just kept shifting and adjusting and eventually got it close enough. And once I get into the materialing and texturing on this, it kind of brings it home because I'm able to add mud and some extra detail to make it look a little more realistic. And here for the decency of the boy, I put a little box there to make everyone a little bit more comfortable. Okay, so now for this next marathon of a section, I'm building out the hair in Cinema 4D using C4D's built-in hair object. And I haven't done a lot of human hair with this. I've played around with it for effects, but this is the first time I've done like a full production using the hair. And so it was a lot of experimentation, a lot of just learning the tools. And in the end, the tools worked out pretty well. There's some things that never felt quite efficient with the workflow, but it was pretty fun being able to comb and cut and curl the hair both with the tools and with the parameters. And it allowed me to quickly see a few different hairstyles on the boy before committing to a longer hairstyle. One tricky thing, though, is that in the end, I think I used the Redshift node or the Redshift tag on the splines of the hair, and so I had to bake down the hair, and the hair object itself turned into like 100 megabytes of space just because every point on every strand of hair had to be saved, and so it turned out to be a pretty dense mesh. And I cleaned it up a little bit, but it ironically ended up being one of the heavier assets in the scene. So here I'm bouncing back and forth, resimulating the hair and trimming it, literally giving it a haircut like you would at a barber shop, seeing how the thickness of the hair reacts and how, sideburns are obviously much shorter than the rest of the hair, and a lot of things that you don't necessarily understand before getting into it. That's why some parts of it, like right here, he looks maybe like an old man because of the shape of the hair, but with enough tweaking, you can kind of find a happy place eventually. And because the boy is obviously the main character of the scene and the focus, I wanted to make sure he had a little bit of extra love put into it just so he rendered well and his hair looked good, his skin looked good, his clothing was properly wrinkled, properly textured. So I'm starting to get to a pretty good spot with the hair. It's still a little clumpy and it's not behaving exactly how I wanted it to, but I'm starting to learn the tools a little bit more too. And I was still unsatisfied, so I decided to go with a more shaggy, longer haircut for the boy. And this was nice because it let gravity do a little bit more of the work. I didn't have to do as much of the grooming on it. Just the natural fall with a little bit of combing off to the side let me land on a hairstyle that felt nice. And because it's raining and his hair would be wet, his hair wouldn't necessarily be perfectly styled, but it'd be a little more matted and clumped together. I was having a lot of issues with his forehead where the hair would penetrate through his forehead, and so even though the hairs, like his bangs, were long, because they went into his forehead, sometimes they got clipped out and didn't look so good for a while. Yeah, I definitely should have gone through some lessons on the C4D hair before diving in, but I ended up kind of brute forcing my way through it and learned all the techniques for at least basic hairstyling. Now I'm just figuring out how to transfer the hair because hair objects are still live geometry. They still calculate until you properly bake it down. And so if you copy it in and out of scenes, it's not necessarily going to be exactly the same because it might not be fully simulated or it might be at a different time in the timeline. And so baking it down to splines makes it so it's absolutely locked. But then as a spline, it acts differently or it renders differently than a hair object. So I had to rebuild the hair material in a Redshift material versus the nice C4D hair material that comes with the hair object. So now here I'm resimulating the pants to fit the standing boy rather than the walking boy. And accounting for the boots, I'm making sure everything's bunched up enough where the boots will fit underneath. Ideally, the boots would be on this 3D character, but because I already had him in the scene, I didn't want to have to rig the boots to the feet and do all that. So I ended up taking the lazy route and just kind of eyeballing it. And here you can see I got it pretty close. I had to scoot some of the polygons out a little bit, but it was close enough. And you know, it's pants. They might fall and they might be a little bit more or less bunched up. So here I'm using, I think for the first time in this video, I think it's called Rhizome Uv. It's an amazing UV unwrapping program where you just select your edges, you cut it, it unwraps it really well. You can keep relaxing and unwrapping, and it even shows you pressure points. So if a few of the UV polygons are especially small or skewed or stretched, they show up red, and the other ones are a little bit more clear. And it just makes UV unwrapping really pleasant, really easy. And you can send it out to Rhizome UV with a click, and then when you save in Rhizome UV, it automatically imports it right back into Cinema 4D. And so you can do the whole cycle of UV unwrapping in, you know, a few clicks just to transfer things back and forth. And so now with it unwrapped, I'm over in Substance Painter, starting to build out a pretty basic wood material and then adding a little bit of detail by hand. And because it was unwrapped so nicely, it's easy to paint either on the 3D object or on the flat unwrap itself. And I'm not especially great at texture painting, so you'll see me kind of struggle through finding out how to pick the colors, how to add detail and where. And you know, this first iteration doesn't turn out perfect, but I come back to it later and add a little bit more love to it. I'm also not especially comfortable with using a Wacom. I usually just use a mouse, so when I do need to do texture painting, I kind of fumble through getting back up to speed with using a pen and tablet system. And being left-handed, I don't know, maybe that's my excuse for never getting up to speed on all that. So here you can see I was using the 2D view a little bit to paint because it's unwrapped, you know, around the circumference of the spear, I can paint directly across and it wraps really well. So things can be straighter lines more easily that way. And I think I'm using a third-party plugin there where it'll export materials really quickly and then import a material that's pre-made with those PNGs automatically without me having to rebuild every material. So here I think I'm rebuilding the hair in Redshift as splines rather than as a hair object. So I had to kind of rethink how those are rendered out. And I think this is the first part of the project I'm really starting to get excited because with the fire looking nice and the smoke and the boy starting to come together, I see a little bit of polish at this stage where I can anticipate something looking really nice in the end. Obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done, but at least part of it's feeling a little bit more complete. And here we're back in Marvelous Designer. I'm building out the jacket. I found a nice pattern online that got me pretty close. Of course, the proportions are different for a smaller boy versus a grown adult, and so I had to first build it out and then really shrink and pull some stuff until it fit him more properly. And I think this pattern didn't have any sleeves on it, so I had to find a rough pattern for sleeves separately. And that's one thing that's probably the hardest in Marvelous Designer is building sleeves, because sleeves are often one piece of material wrapped around the arm, but in this program you can't really bend geometry easily. There are ways that you can map it around parts of the body, but because I have a custom mesh and I didn't build a custom cage, I have to kind of simulate and then stitch for some of the stuff, and you'll see that here soon enough. But yeah, as I'm building this out, I'm putting all the pieces in place, and then you can see the stitches in 3D space. So when you simulate, all those stitches zip together and kind of compress and capture whatever avatar you have in there. And this version of Marvelous Designer was the one right before they added GPU processing. So now you can crank the resolution and simulate way, way faster than what it was on the CPU. So that's very exciting. So this version of the jacket is very large, a little like a boy wearing his mother or father's jacket. So I need to keep trimming it up and adjusting it until it fits him a little bit better. Another funny thing about Marvelous Designer is that because I'm working in this kind of simulated environment on the left, if I undo and go back to the flat pre-3D mode, it kind of undoes a lot of stuff. So once you get into a simulated space, it can be a little tricky to go all the way back and add a piece of fabric because you're dealing with something that's already kind of simulated and already wrapped around the body. It's possible, but it can be a little finicky. And here to make it a little bit more form-fitting, I added a few seams around the waist and made those elastic so they would pull in a little bit and hug his torso so the fabric wouldn't be so boxy. And it was just an excuse to get a little bit more wrinkles into the jacket because wrinkles are what make cloth look so great. And as you can see here, the mesh is kind of lower res, and so the wrinkles are nice, but they're not maybe especially robust. And I think eventually I'd turn up the resolution of the mesh a little bit more, and so in the elastic you get a lot more of the bunching. Okay, you can kind of see it there. The elastic's really starting to look nice and bunchy. But with a mesh this dense, the actual file size of the OBG gets pretty rough. Like you can see the resolution here is pretty high for an asset that's pretty small in frame. Especially with all the stitching, like every thread has those little stitch marks, which from a distance you can't see at all. And so later on I re-output the mesh without all the extra little details, and it saves a ton of space and it makes the overall workflow much quicker. And here I think I'm also increasing the resolution of the pants, just getting them a little bit more wrinkly. Yeah, and sometimes there is a little bit of penetration that in Marvelous Designer it's sometimes hard to have the fabric crumple up like this and not overlap. And I was trying to fix that in Cinema 4D, but I realized I should just go back in Marvelous and see if I can flop it around a little bit more and get it so it's not overlapping, because it's a lot quicker to do in Marvelous, even though it can be challenging. So here, this new version of the pants is a lot cleaner, a lot less overlapping. So it'll require a lot less finishing work in Cinema. And ideally, I would probably do that stuff in ZBrush, but my ZBrush skills are so limited that C4D sculpting is good enough for some basic stuff like this. Here I'm finding some color reference from Zelda, of course, to match his boots, pants, and jacket. And it turned out to be such a lovely color palette that I was happy with it as is, just straight from that reference image. So now at this point, the boy is basically complete. I'll come back to it a little bit and keep finessing, but for the most part, his main pieces are all in place. Yeah, even his face has a little subsurface scattering, which I'm adjusting here, and then his hair has some translucency and maybe a little subsurface. I kind of forget. And it was tricky. Like here, you can see the face is really hot. The edges of his lit part are a little too red, and so I had to pull back quite a bit. But I think I left it a little exaggerated, so even at a distance, you get a sense of the flushness of his skin. And I turned the light to white so I could make sure his skin and face looked proper, and then I would shift back to the red light so I can get that nice flame glow. Here I'm just adjusting the point light I have for the flame. Initially I was hoping that the fire itself would be bright enough to light the scene, but it was a little unpredictable and clipped out a little bit weird in different places, and so I ended up just going with the spotlight for most of the light source. And that way I could really sculpt where the light was coming from, and I'd have a lot more control. Here I'm working on the hair material, getting the reflectivity and shininess of it to be locked in a little bit more. Here, I guess I'm back in the smoke simulation trying to get maybe something that's a little bit more detailed or just a better shape overall. I think maybe I was hoping to get a higher resolution of the smoke, because before I was probably rendering at something a little bit lower, and when you get that close, and with me planning on rendering this final image fairly large, I wanted to make sure the smoke detail was really sharp even up close. So now I'm working on getting the forest area lit a little bit more. Because the cave is behind some trees and kind of further back in the scene, light doesn't have a tendency to fall on it very well. And so at this point, I just kind of threw a light shooting directly on it. It was definitely a little harsher and a little stronger than it needed to be, but I needed at least to start somewhere and see how light might bounce around in there. And you'll notice several times through the video, Cinema 4D just does a hard crash, and I have to reboot, which is, I guess, kind of normal when you start getting into a scene that's larger and you have a lot of big assets, a lot of materials, just a lot of stuff going on. So here you can see I'm starting to use the Ies Lights for the street light rather than just a spotlight. That gives it that nice strong beam in the center and the kind of natural breakup as it approaches the sides. And one trick here was making sure it balanced between the spotlight, or the street light, and the boy's torch. Because even though the streetlight would be much brighter in reality. We don't want to pull too much attention away from the boy. And so eventually I massage that a little bit more and make sure that the boy and eventually the doorway he left the house from is the focus and not just this random streetlight in the background. So here I started with the pre-built fire hydrant from Cinema 4D, and it's a great model, but it's very dense, a lot of detail that was not necessary from a distance. So I'm just going through and replacing some of the bolts and removing some edge loops that I don't need, just so I don't bog down the system with this tiny little prop in the background. Now I'm back at the cave again, starting to sculpt out the terrain to match the kind of rocky bits I had built before. And I think I used a volume builder just to blend all those rocks together to get a more natural kind of clumpy shape rather than a bunch of random spheres. And very quickly I realized here that even though the cave is pretty far in the background, it's hard to tell how far back because the camera's so low and there's not a lot of leading lines. So I had to make sure I sculpted that terrain in front of the cave to be, go down a little bit and then come back up so you see that passage of, Z depth. And what also helped that is the size of the ferns get smaller as I go back closer to the cave, and so you have a few depth cues with the size of things, and I think a little bit of depth fog as well later on. And here I'm just choosing where to put the plants. I wanted to make sure that the path was clear enough to also help lead the eye back in space. If there's just pure grass and shrubs along the whole forest floor, I don't think you'd be able to see much of that depth. Here I'm just tweaking a handful of little things and starting back on the house, working on the window materials and building on a little bit more detail so that when it's lit and populated on the inside, things will look all right. Right here I spent a little bit too much time trying to make proper edge flow on the rear of the building that we'll never see. But in my mind, it was important at the time, and maybe that's my OCD tendencies taking over. And the side of the building was looking really plain, even with a little bit of weathering, some wetness applied. It'd still be a little simple, so I added these wood panels to break up the color and add a little bit more detail. And this concrete texture worked really well because it has these, lines that go around each panel. And so I just fitted that to the key shapes of the building to give it kind of a natural breakup that I didn't have to model by hand. And now here, based on that original photo I used as reference that you can see on the right, there's a few of those really thin stripes of metal. So I'm finding all the edges where those metal pieces are, and instead of texturing it properly, I'm just using that as a selection. So when I apply a material, I can just apply it to those stripes and just have a kind of global texture for that. Yeah, as you can see there, those lines just pop out just from the selection tags on the main model. of course, when you bevel edges, it adds some extra edges in places you don't want, so I had to go through and clean those up a bit. Now for the doorknob, I started with a very traditional doorknob because, you know, what you have in your mind is always a simplified, iconic version of it. But then I quickly realized, you know, these houses, they're modern. They have all the common technologies and the modern conveniences. So I quickly shifted to make a more kind of robust, almost like bank vault style front door where you have a keypad, you have a fingerprint scanner. I'm sure there's RFID in this system somehow. And so that just further separates the modern, you know, building from the very natural side of the forest. Here I'm just doing the same paneling to the other side. And thanks to Mega Scans, I was able to quickly find a wood paneling texture that was really close to what I had in mind. And then in Redshift, I just built a bunch of nodes and kind of adjusted the values and some of the color saturation to fit it into the scene a little bit better. And because those wood panels they are prominent, but they're not going to be extremely exposed in the end, I didn't have to worry too much about covering up repetition or, you know, tiling. So here the idea is that the boy has just left his condo, his parents' place, and he left the door open. So having this light inside the house just blasting out at first was my idea to make it look right, but pretty quickly I realized that if you open a living room door, there's not a huge like light panel right inside the doorway. So eventually I moved the light back, put it more in the position of where a ceiling light would be, and it made the light cast a lot more realistic. But of course, being kind of ping-ponging around in this environment, I decided to go back to the forest and start populating it with some rocks and trees that were from Megascans as well. And here, I was struggling a little bit getting the displacement right because they give you both JPEG and EXR displacement maps. And with the EXR displacement map, because you have such a wide color like gamut, it's a little tricky to find where the detail is, versus if you just use the JPEG, it's already balanced where the blacks and whites are pretty well balanced where it fills the whole color space. And I didn't figure that out right away, and so I had to kind of manually tweak the min and max of these until it looked right. But even still, this process was so much faster than what it used to be when you would download it and reassemble things very manually. And now that I have, 3 or 4 solid rocks downloaded, I was able to take those and duplicate those around and with position, scale, and rotation adjustments, make them all look different enough. And just like that, you got a cave. And there's some sort of campfire in the cave giving off that glow, and eventually I'll boost that light a little bit more so it's obvious that there's some stuff coming out of there. And here I'm starting to work on the materials of the leaves a little bit, and these trees are still pretty placeholder, but I wanted to see how the leaves would at least react in the space. And sometimes a temp asset turns out to be good enough, but for this hero tree, I'll definitely be recreating it in speed tree later. And now I started playing around with the depth fog and environment, because in this scene it is raining, it is kind of a cold night, and so there would be some fog. In the end, I didn't use the environment itself, but rather a few clouds that I generate, and that way I had more control over where those pops of fog would happen. Now the manhole is making another guest appearance. I'm finally taking it into Rhizome Uv to unwrap, and then Substance Painter to put a layer of proper texture on it. And again, I'm not a texture painter by trade, and so the process here is definitely not the most efficient, but you can see I'm using the tools to kind of pull out some AO detail and get the dust and the dirt to kind of fall in the cracks a little bit. And it's funny too, because if you look at the reference on the right, that's a reference of, it's a real photo. And then you look at what I have in Substance, and it looks very similar, but it doesn't necessarily look right. Like sometimes there's some intricacies, some little bits of detail that don't quite translate one to one. I think Cinema crashed there, so I had to reboot. And this manhole will only be seen from a very steep angle, and so even if it looks great from straight above, like it does there, eventually, when it's at a steep angle and it's reflecting light, you're not really going to see a lot of the diffuse information necessarily. It's going to be almost entirely reflecting of the boy's torch. And so that's something to consider when putting time into any of these things, is, knowing how much is going to be visible and how it's going to be lit, so you don't spend too much time on one little section of it. For this warning sign that goes right next to the fence, I wanted it to look kind of like a park sign you would see warning you about, the dangers ahead. And so I, hopped into font base, I think it's called. Found a nice font that looked very signerly and just laid it out based on that reference I found there. And here, using the Noun project, I was really quickly able to see all these different styles of shape, and downloaded one that ended up kind of matching the theme. I intended to do it more of like a monster or an alien or something, but it seemed a little too far-fetched, a little too out of the realm of this universe I'm building, so ended up going with more of a traditional predator. Even though there's probably not literally lions in this forest, but it gets the point across. And with Substance Painter, you're really quickly able to use all the grunges that they have and kind of rough something up and peel stuff away, or add dirt detail or edge detail like rust or just wear and tear. It's also really easy to get heavy-handed in it and just throw the kitchen sink at it and end up with something that's a little too bump mappy or a little bit too exaggerated. But this is a sign that's long since fallen off its posts and has had many seasons of wear and tear, so it should look pretty distressed. So that shape back there that you saw briefly is a little shadow caster, because I didn't want to model 1,000 trees that are out of frame just to throw shadows. So that helps kind of throw the right side into the shade a little bit more to block that light. Now things are starting to come together a little bit more. The overall frame is looking finished enough, like pieces aren't missing like they were before. Obviously there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, but things are starting to look nice. So here I jumped into Houdini really quick, and I do not know Houdini by any means, but I know how to make a cloud in it. So I hopped in here really quick just to make a cloud that I would reuse throughout the scene as more of a fog element than actual clouds in the sky. But it's nice to be able to start with a really high quality asset and then, scale it as needed to control the level of kind of turbulence that you see in it. And what's nice about having individual cloud or fog elements versus an environment fog is that you can kind of tuck them away, so they might show up behind a building or lower in the scene, and maybe higher in the scene it's clearer because it's maybe a low fog. And right here it actually looks really cool just creeping around the corner. It wasn't very realistic, of course, because fog doesn't usually clump together that densely. So in the end I do pull it back a lot, but it's nice to be able to see what's possible and how far you can push it. It's also a real challenge not pushing it too far, because I know as a 3D artist it's fun to find something that looks cool and push it way beyond the realm of possibility just because it looks fun, but then you pull back and realize, well, that doesn't look at all realistic. And so yeah, it's always a balance there. So here I had used this utility pole before just kind of for fun, and I remembered that it existed, and so I went back to the Gumroad. I think I might have spent $1 on it or something to support the guy, but this would have taken me ages to build. It's such a high quality model, lots of detail, and so I was able to pull it in. I did a little bit of optimization on it, just removing some extraneous detail, but so quickly you just pop it in, it looks great. It's so far back in the scene it'll just be silhouetted, so I didn't even have to worry about adding any materials to it. I think I might have just used a dark material on it. So now for the sides of these condos, there's a lot of kind of blank space on the wood paneling, and I thought it'd be nice to break that up a little bit and have some ivy growing or some sort of stuff to just break it up and remove the repetition of that wood paneling a little bit. And again, with mega scans, it almost looks like these are just flat images, but there is some 3D leaf detail in addition to the flat planes, and so it's a really efficient way to use textures to add a lot of detail without increasing the geometry in the scene too much. So now here we are in SpeedTree. This is a program I've used a few times, but I'm not really an expert. So at first I tried to build completely from scratch the tree I wanted, and I got pretty close, but the leaves ended up being the tricky part, because the leaves on real trees are really specific. The way they grow, how big they are, how clumped together they are. So if you just try to wing it, it just doesn't really work out. So eventually I start from a templated tree and then adjust that to my liking rather than starting totally from scratch. So because I'm starting from scratch on this version, I went over to Megascans to get a bark texture and a leaf texture so that I could just bring those right into SpeedTree and see how they look as I build it out. And SpeedTree is awesome because, well, for many reasons, but one thing is that you can build a magnet, or you drop a magnet in the scene, and it has a gravitational force on the tree, and so you can really pull and twist the branches really, really quickly, in addition to individual like turbulence on the trunk shape and all that. So here you can see me struggling a little bit with the leaf placement, how, leaves show up on the ends of twigs, which show up on the ends of branches, which are on the trunk. And so there's a very specific hierarchy. And with SpeedTree, you can customize all of that pretty infinitely. And so there's a lot of places to get it wrong. So here you can see me really trying to make it work, and it's not quite getting there, and I don't know what's going on. But hey, learning a lot in the process, So here I pull in a pre-built basic tree and start kind of sculpting and contorting on top of that rather than starting from scratch. And this tree was nice because it already came with the roots installed and kind of laid out nicely, and a lot of the stuff was already figured out. And I thought it'd be cool if pieces of the bark were peeling off, and in SpeedTree it's pretty easy to build that, but it's not necessarily the right choice for everything. And I didn't have a good bark peeling material, so I just kind of made one up, and in the end, I mean, you can see how it looks cool, but it doesn't look right. And so I think in the end I decided to just fully delete all the peeling and just leave the tree as a basic tree thing. What's also nice about SpeedTree is that you can isolate pretty much any element. So here you can see I'm just working on that one little piece of the tree, and that way you're not distracted by the million other leaves simulating around, and you can focus on just like what that one piece looks like and how many segments it has, what resolution it is. Another thing I had to keep in mind is that this tree is a hero tree that's in the extreme foreground on the right, and so most of the tree won't be visible in the scene. It's only this little piece, like right under the left side of it. And so even though I was designing kind of wide out, I realized, I need to zoom really far in and make sure the detail is put where it needs to be. So like for here, I'm adding this little twig that adds a little bit of detail just where I need it, just in that little side of it. So here I exported the entire tree, every leaf as an OBJ element. I mean, all baked together, but nothing is instance, so it's really huge. And I think SpeedTree might support instancing of leaves, but I didn't dive deep enough to figure out all that. So I just started with this, knowing that I would delete most of the leaves and kind of manually clean it up. Yeah, like right here you can see I'm starting to select and trim out all the stuff that's not necessary. Yeah, because working with such a large asset, like if I instance this a couple times, the scene's going to really slow down because there's so much detail in these trees. Every little twig has geometry, and so you really have to be delicate with how much of that you put in there. And here, I just thought it looked nice, so I wanted to do a little test render with the sky to see how the tree would look in a normal environment before I worked on the materials anymore. So here for the first time, I'm bringing it actually into the scene, seeing how it plays. And of course, the scale and the position of everything is a little bit different than I anticipated, so I had to manually shift the trunk shape a little bit, and I think I end up curling it here in a second too. Or bending it, rather. Here I'm just trying to get the lighting on those branches to look accurate and look nice. You know, you spend all this time making an asset, you want to be able to see it, but then at the end of the day, you need to make sure it's lit accurately, so it might be more silhouetted than anything. Like here, I'm trying to throw this light, like simulating a little moonlight hitting it, and it looks super rad, but would a tree be that bright, you know, that low in the forest? Because the whole rest of the tree would be shadowing it, so, you know, this is obviously a little brighter than it needed to be, and I think eventually I realize that and adjust accordingly. Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, I sometimes go a little heavy-handed on materials, and so I wanted to make sure this was possibly legible, and so I cleaned up that sign a little bit. And now digging through mega scans, I knew they had a few kind of trash items or like refuse, and they didn't have a lot of stuff I wanted. I wanted to feature some Amazon boxes to show, you know, how easy we have it. We don't even have to leave the house to get what we need, and couldn't find a good image of that. So I took a couple photos of an Amazon box I had on hand to use as a texture, and that ended up being exactly what I needed, because I mean that's literally what it is, an old Amazon box that I think I weathered a little bit to get looking wet too. And yeah, in order to get a bump map and a height map, I kind of hand painted a little bit, made all the stickers and the tape white so they would be, you know, extended, and then the shadows, the like crevices, I darkened so that the height map would be somewhat usable. And then I dimmed down the rest of it so that would be a more neutral space. There you can see the bump map in action a little bit on that sticker there. You see that bump? And then to simulate the wetness of the rainy environment, I just added a noise and I think darkened itself on top of itself to get it a little soggy looking. Very simple technique, but sometimes you don't need a lot of effort if it's just a common phenomenon like that. Yeah, just like that, you get a pile of Amazon boxes that look realistic enough. And here I realized that corner of the scene was totally in darkness, and in reality there'd be more streetlights, more city glow on that kind of left side. Maybe someone has a lawn light or some sort of lamppost. And so I threw a light in that corner to kind of hit the corner of that trash can and all those Amazon boxes. And the sidewalk is something I'd been ignoring this entire time, so I finally decided to give it a little bit of texture and detail. And initially I wanted to roughen it up and really chip away at it, but because these are new condos and maybe it's freshly poured concrete, I decided to leave that edge of the sidewalk pretty clean. There'd be a little roughness in the material, but I didn't have to chip away at it too much. And some of these assets, like the sidewalk and the street, I was able to leave parametric as like a sweep object for pretty far into the project. Some items I didn't even bake down because they didn't necessarily need to be fully editable. Now I'm just working on the materials for the manhole and the sewage drain. And these assets are so small in the scene that they get away with just a medium amount of texture detail, a little roughness in the reflection to break it up and make it look a little wetter. Now it's time to get back into the houses, get the lighting looking a little bit better on the windows, and start to think about what's inside of these buildings. Because obviously, if every window is exactly the same, it's not going to look lived in. Like, no building has every window looking exactly the same. And so I start building out some living room details, a couple speakers and a TV set. And this living room, this is where the boy is leaving from, and so this is his space, so we want to see inside the living room a little bit. The blinds are open, and so we see the life that he's walking away from at the moment. And again, because I'm such a Zelda fan and use that as a lot of inspiration in this piece very subtly, I figured it appropriate that they would be playing Zelda on the big screen. So here you can start to see that living room is coming to life a little bit. There's some of those warm ceiling lights in the environment, giving it that very, warm glow that we're all used to. And because everything was so small and so kind of put back into space, I didn't mind just grabbing a generic couch, a generic TV, and just populating it very simply. Now for the background, I wanted to give a little life to some of the windows and show that there are other people in this world. It's not just the boy. So in the upstairs of the background building, there's this woman talking on her phone, probably in her bedroom. And there's, a rear ceiling light casting a shadow that hits the blinds. And it's pretty incredible. In Redshift, you just make the material a little bit translucent, and that shadow on the back side pulls through, and you get to see it on the front side. Now we're back in Rhizome UV unwrapping this little trash can. And because this is a prop that's in the extreme foreground, I needed to make sure it was unwrapped properly so all the materials and the textures fit on there well, and I was able to hand paint some detail on top of it. And hopefully you can see how Rhizome UV just so quickly unwrapped that really well. Really, really predictable results. And now here I'm back in Substance. Point up a reference and starting to paint the basic plastic texture on the bottom and then adding detail on top of that. And a lot of times you can get away with blasting one texture on the whole thing. Like here, I'm not really hand painting that much yet. I mean, here it is, but for the roughness on the plastic, I didn't have to hand paint anything. You just use a grunge material as a base, and you get that good, and then you can kind of hand paint these smaller details. And as always, it's really easy to get a little heavy-handed and add more detail than is realistically there. And so you have to pull back, find that reference, keep cross-checking. Because it is fun to push it too far, but then you realize, shit, need to pull back a little bit. So here, I think I'm considering more final trees rather than just placeholder trees. So before I was just using the default kind of Cinema 4D trees that they have in their content library. But now I wanted to pull in some Forester trees, get a little bit more customization and more detail in there. And because these trees aren't the hero trees, it's okay if their branches aren't perfectly smooth or things aren't absolutely pristine like how Speed Tree can get you. And using that cloud asset I made, I was able to push the trees in that cloud a little bit so they fall off into the forest. So this part compositionally got a little tricky because at first there was a really big distinction between the forest and the city with kind of a gap between the two. And now some of these new trees are starting to reach out over and almost like encompass the boy a little bit and cover up his position, which in turn protects him from the rain, which the city is getting pummeled with. So here there's more balancing of that cave light, making sure it pops enough, especially with all the trees shading that whole section of the scene. It needed to be bright enough to be visible still. Here I'm just trying to find a nice airplane asset that I can just pop in without having to model by hand, because of course an airplane's been modeled before and you don't have to start from scratch on that kind of stuff. And with these Ies Lights, it's so easy to really get that nice light cast. And if you ever need an Ies light, you just go into the content browser in Cinema and type Ies, just the letters I, E, and S, and you'll be able to find what feels like thousands of different examples, because they're all from the light bulb manufacturers, I think. I don't know if they have to, but they often submit kind of a profile, a shape of these lights, and Cinema 4D is able to recognize that shape and use it to throw light more accurately. So here I'm both working on the airplane and adjusting those trees to get them a little bit more balanced out. That one tree I put in there a minute ago was getting a little intense. Part of that too has to do with the lighting. If the light doesn't hit them as much, they fall back into the background a lot quicker. Now here I'm just kind of rebuilding the couch material, making sure it looks okay from a distance, but it doesn't need to have pretty much any detail because it'll be pretty far back there, and any real detail would be soft at that distance. Coming back to the shopping basket, I realized that the handles are a lot longer than they should have been, so I tweaked those in a little bit. and further building out the cave entrance, just duplicating some of those rocks. So earlier for the rain, I just had a cloner cloning these little teardrop shapes, and I was able to get a general area that the rain was in, but I wanted the rain in this final version to be a lot more accurate because there's a lot of trees, there's a lot of stuff in the way, and so the rain wouldn't be this perfect wall where it's raining or not raining, but rather, different sections that have more or less rain. Like the hero tree in the foreground, is a pretty big tree, it's pretty close to the boy, and so it'd be blocking a lot of the rain there. So using X particles, I roughly outlined the overall shape where the rain would make it all the way to either the buildings or the street, and then just use the rain effect that's kind of pre-built into X particles to get that going. And in order to get the splashes on the ground, I had to add a collision tag, an X particles collision tag to that, so they bounce off and you get that nice secondary splash. And I think the way I did it is I made a trail for each particle, so the rain doesn't have to be rendered with motion blur, which is why, raindrops appear longer, as they're not actually that long, but the exposure or the shutter speed of the cameras are long enough that they travel a distance, hence the motion blur. So instead I just added a trail, so I rendered the trails separately rather than just the little point. So now I'm finally adding some detail to the house. Before I was just relying on tiling normal materials over it. But in order to make it look realistic, I had to go in and add some little wear and tear and some wet spots because it is raining, and if things get wet, obviously they have some drainage or some leakage, and so there might be some mold or something growing, and that kind of discolors some of it. And with these houses being somewhat modern and new, I didn't want to dirty them up too much. They're still, in the first couple years of construction or having been recently built. So the wear and tear was light, but the amount of kind of rain wetness was more the focus. And of course, I think I slightly changed the model since I UV unwrapped, so I had to deal with a little bit of reselecting some of these shapes and adding a selection tag. Because for those pieces, I think I still just use the generic metal material and don't have a fully textured asset for those. Now here I'm adjusting the living room light, making it not so perfectly godlike, and positioning it where the ceiling light would be, like I was mentioning earlier. And here it is a balance of realism versus fantasy. Like you want those god rays to be really prominent and really bright, but you don't want it to be too surreal. So it was challenging finding that balance, but I think in the end it was subtle enough while still capturing your attention. And you'll notice there's a bit of a stripe down the center of the image from the door to the torch to the cave light. So hopefully viewers' attention will ping pong back and forth between those elements. Now I jumped back into Quixel Mixer to adjust the asphalt. I wasn't loving how the light was reflecting on the ground on the street, and so I thought I'd give it another shot, add a little bit more detail, and kind of paint out some of the repetition. You can kind of see in the middle there's a bit of a line where the seam is. So I wanted to try to iron that out a little bit, get it nice and smooth. And here you can see a failed attempt where I was trying to add little ripples to the texture to make it look like rain was falling. But that ended up being a little too laborious, and I wanted to keep some of the clarity in the reflection so you could see the buoy. So it's not necessarily the most realistic execution with the rain and the puddles, but I don't know, I think it looks all right. It's not that distracting that the puddles are smooth enough. So here I can work in the Master Sword into the reflection of the puddle. And to do this, I place the Master Sword in the boy's hand, but I don't want it to render in his hand. I only want it to show up in the reflection. So to do that, I added a Redshift tag and have it not primarily visible, but visible in the secondary rays, such as a reflection. So that way, you get that nice reflection of the Master Sword in the puddle, but in his hand, he's still holding the stick or the spear. And for the spear, I had to add a tag, a Redshift tag, and then have it not visible in the reflections. So, in real world, you only see the spear, and in the reflection, you only see the sword. So now I'm working on that street a little bit more. Now that I've shifted the asphalt material, kind of revisiting some of the other elements of it. Now I'm just tweaking the materials on the manhole a little bit. Because it's such a steep angle, the reflection is really all you see, and so I had to shift that a little bit, make sure it matched the wetness look of the asphalt. So as you can see, a lot of time is spent going back to these assets, unwrapping them, giving them proper texture, some hand-painted elements that make them a lot more visceral and real and not just procedural, because if you just do everything procedurally and only have your AO and your curve maps doing all the work, then you're never going to get the really nice leakage or the wear and the tear that the weather and, people walking by scratching it or painting graffiti on it will get. And here in Substance Painter, there's so many nice alphas that come with it. So a lot of times you don't even have to leave the program if you're just detailing up a smaller asset that's not a hero thing. You can get away with the simple icons or some of the nice handprints or little bits of leakage that they have. And in this scene, half of the time I just darken a material until it kind of falls into the environment. Because right now the bottom of the light pole is kind of bright. It kind of stands out among the scene. And even if that's realistic, I don't necessarily want this random little metal pole in the background grabbing your attention. And here I'm revisiting the staff or the spear. At first, the scratch marks were very soft, almost like it was sanded away. And so on this pass, I'm giving it a lot more contrast. Bigger chunks are broken out, or the bark has been chipped away from a lot of heavy use. And I think because this texture is 4K, I'm able to get pretty close and have nice detail, even if I'm just scratching little messages on it. And here I'm going through and just removing a lot of the super heavy detail in the jacket that's really unnecessary for this render. You don't need stitching when your camera's that far away and your subject's relatively small in scene. And here I think I noticed that I exported, well, for one, I exported it without the UVs set up properly, so things were overlapping quite a bit. And then two, I exported it with all the seams and all those little stitch marks, but also with a thickness. And at first I figured, real clothing has thickness and I want to capture that. But what it does is it literally doubles your polygon count, because every polygon now has a pair because it has thickness. So pretty quickly I realized, like, you never need to add thickness in Marvelous Designer if you're going to export it to Cinema 4D or anywhere, because it's really easy to add thickness later on without cranking your polygon count right away. Now, because it's such a rainy day and the boy is about to go on an adventure, he's already got his boots muddied up a little bit. He's maybe walked directly through the yard and across a couple mud puddles, and so he's got a little dirty boots. And here I experiment with adding some metal rivets and relying on the material to do some of the extra detailing work. And I don't know if you can tell, but the mesh on the jacket is a lot lighter weight now. The last time I exported it in this version, I turned down the resolution just a little bit because it was getting really heavy, and those tiny details were still in there even with the resolution cranked down just a little bit. You don't want to pull it down too much, because then you lose, like, where the elastic bunches up. You kind of lose that detail. So this little guy, his name's Tuffy. He was a Thai beanie baby that I had as a child, and he was my favorite. I didn't have any pets growing up, and so he was kind of like my pet and my, companion. So I decided to model his head and put him in the pocket of the boy. And again, box modeling and modeling in general is not necessarily my strong suit, so the process may be a little unorthodox. But this whole process has been really fun, just learning Substance Painter a lot more, because it's so powerful, but it's a little tricky to get used to. There's a lot of layers, and each layer has multiple layers of detail, because each layer has a normal, like a normal pass, a diffuse, a reflection, and all that. And so you might want to paint just on the bump map, but not affect the color. And so there's a lot of layer trickery that goes on. But once you get the flow of it, it works really well. Now you can see I got the boots in there, got the little stuffed animal. The boy is getting more and more complete. And I noticed in the background there is a patch of just flat geometry that you could see a little bit, so I wanted to throw a little bit more nature bits in there to fill it out, make it a little bit more lush. And when dealing with trees and foliage, it so quickly gets so thick. Like, every tree has so many branches, every branch has so many leaves, every clump of grass is super dense, and so you really have to deal with layers and good scene organization, because if you're working on one thing, you want to toggle everything off so you can actually function, because Cinema 4D is pushing a lot of polygons around, and if you have everything enabled all the time, you're just going to be working at 1 frame a second if you're lucky. And I think here I was getting a bit of a weird reflection in this material, and it took me a while to find the source of it. I think I had to soften up those reflections a little bit to reduce those sharp highlights in the soil section of the forest. And you've probably noticed I have that golden spiral in the viewport activated a lot of the time. From the beginning of the project, I wanted to have a lot of structure, a lot of effort put into the overall composition, and not just making something and then throwing a camera somewhere that looks cool. I wanted to really sculpt where everything was. And so working with the golden spiral was kind of a leading light that helped me decide where to put the effort and where to put the detail. And hopefully that helps viewers look at it in a very natural way, like things flow into each other pretty smoothly. Here I got some mossy witch's hair moss that I can just kind of drape along the tree trunks and the branches to give it a little bit more life and make it a little bit spookier, a little bit more uninviting. And one nice thing about Redshift is that it's really easy to use the alpha to cut out geometry, so that when a photon or a ray goes through the geometry, it doesn't have to calculate another pass of opacity, because it literally cuts out the alpha rather than calculating it as like a zero transparency, if that makes sense. So when you have tons and tons of leaves or, hanging moss like this, it's not calculating 20 layers of moss even if there's nothing there. Because it's cut out, the ray just shoots right through it. So here, this is a rock right next to the entrance of the cave, and I wanted to add a little bit of, almost like a warning. And so I put these hands and designed this kind of random, archaic-looking shape, and eventually I pull back a little bit on the design of it because it kind of distracts from the overall tone of the piece, but at the time I thought it was a good idea. It's also just a lot of fun painting on a highly detailed asset, because you can use the rock or use the edges as inspiration for what someone would do in the real world. Like if you're painting on a rock, it might be fun to paint the edges and kind of build yourself a curvature map, but in real life. So here I am just cleaning up this airplane. There's tons of different objects and geometry, and in cinema, when you have a lot of separate objects, things get bogged down, because I think it's more information to calculate. So if you can combine objects and minimize duplication, you can save a lot in performance. And I think what I did here is I literally baked the texture from, I think there was maybe like 10 textures it was using, and I used the C40 texture baking just to make one diffuse channel for the whole thing. And the UVs are terrible. It's not at all optimized, but I reduced it down to one material rather than, say, 10 or so. And here I'm further trying to optimize. This hair object is so dense. There's so many points, and let's say there's 20,000 hairs and each hair has maybe 10 or 20 points. It's a lot of information for something that looks so simple. And here I'm testing out some polygon reduction for the pants and the jacket, seeing how far I can push it while still retaining as much of that wrinkle detail as possible. And because I'm only rendering this as a still frame, render times aren't that big of an issue, but it's more so just in cinema performance. Here I'm doing the same thing, further reducing the telephone pole, cleaning up a lot of the tree detail, just deleting things I don't need. And I think going through this process, I reduced the scene from, maybe 800 megabytes down to 1 or 200 megabytes, which makes autosaving a lot faster. Even on an M2 card, you're still waiting a little bit for that, nearly gigabyte scene to save. So even if you spend a couple hours optimizing, you might save even more time in the end from all the time you'll save while saving. Here I'm just continuing to optimize, reducing. There's a lot of duplicated materials that came through with all the vegetation stuff, so spending a little time getting those in order. Now here I'm looking for planks and pieces for the fence. Like I was talking about earlier, I made those really rough shapes just as placeholder, knowing that I would come back and find a properly scanned asset to use. And thankfully with Megascans, there's so many things out there that are already built out that you don't have to spend the several hours just to make a handful of unique planks. It's just already done for you. Now I'm back on the roof adding some little Christmas lights to the railings. Even though I'd never add lights to the actual Christmas lights, I still put them in there so you can see a little bit of that silhouette detail. For this AC unit, I wanted something very industrial. It's a big condo, or this unit might be sourcing or giving air to a couple units, and so it needed to be pretty big and ominous. It's not just a window air conditioner unit, but it's a proper, underground system. And because this is such a background asset, I didn't bother modeling out every panel, every detail. I just took an image online and made removed the perspective by using the perspective tool in Photoshop and just plastered it onto that cube. Because sometimes you don't need all that manual detail labor. And this little guy is just a security camera that'll be on the corners of some of the houses, further separating the city from the forest. And the beauty of making all these little props that go in the background is you can really quickly just, rough out a cable that runs along the wall and not have to worry about spending any time detailing it, because all you need is for it to pick up just a little bit of light or cast a little bit of a shadow. And this is going to be eventually the Rooftop Umbrella. I searched online for quite a while trying to find an asset I could download or purchase, because it seemed complicated trying to figure this out and manually do it. But I couldn't find anything that was exactly what I wanted, so I decided to simulate it myself. And here I'm using the X-Particles cloth because I wanted all the X-Particle tools that I could use. And now in Cinema 4D R21 with force fields, I think I could accomplish a very similar thing with C4D cloth and the effectors or attractors or what have you. But with a little bit of work, I was able to get that umbrella looking good enough to be up on the roof. And again, this acts mostly as a silhouette, so not too much attention to detail needed to be given. And to pair with the table, I decided to throw in a couple chairs, which I think I come back to in a minute. And at this point in the whole process, I'm getting a lot closer to the end, so I'm hopping around between assets a lot more and just picking on things that I feel like could use a little bit more attention. Or, for instance, the mailbox hadn't had a texture built for it yet, so I grabbed a photo, made it square just like with the air conditioner, and just mapped it right on because, again, this will be a distant object and it doesn't need everything modeled out by hand. And this is a sticker that one of my buddies made for me for my bachelor party of my face. And so, of course, I had to plaster that over the scene a few times. And I don't even know if you can make it out in the final render, but at least I know it's there. So this is one thing I kind of struggled with Substance Painter, is that it's not Photoshop. It doesn't have some of the tools you're used to. You can't necessarily select a layer and give it a stroke as easily in Photoshop, or maybe you can, but I'm just a lot more familiar with Photoshop, and so doing some simple things, even like laying out text, is pretty tricky as far as I understand in Substance. So a lot of times you might spit out a diffuse and then finish it in Photoshop, or build some text in Photoshop and then bring it into Substance. So here I wanted to put a car in the background to show that, there's a little bit more life in this world. And as I was building the environment, my plan was to have the entire car in there. But then I realized if it's that far in the background, it's kind of in the shadows, you might not even see the whole car, but rather just the headlights. And so here I just painted some Tesla headlights, just using a reference image, and then used that as an emission material. And so without having to have any car in there, really, you just get a sense that there's something back there. And in the end, I decided to take this out because it made that parking little driveway look more like a road rather than a driveway. And I didn't see a good way of solving that with having a car there, so I eventually just take the car out. But that was the process there anyway. So now I'm just in tweaking mode, working on the materials of these leaves, getting them the right shininess and the right transmissiveness. And now taking those same leaves, I'm just manually adding a few stuck-on leaves to the front of this house, just because it's a windy day and it's raining, so the leaves would stick to wet surfaces. And here I just manually took that atlas and made a few square planes around each one and cut those out and manually placed them in the scene. And these little details don't show up that much in the final render, but even if they just take up a few pixels, it still shows you that there's information there, and those little details can add up to be a lot more realistic in the end. And for this window texture, again, because it's raining, I wanted to have some sort of, bump map or a roughness map to break up the light a little bit, just to show you that there's actually glass there and it's not just a clear, open window. And so here I'm balancing using an actual rain material and just kind of splotchy bits of roughness, which end up making it look a little bit foggy or misty in the windows. And for this, it might look really good up close, but when the camera is all the way back here, you lose a lot of that detail. So I had to further tweak the materials to get that roughness and that kind of mistiness to show up. Now here I'm populating the inside of the house, putting up a wedding photo on the wall just to add a little bit more life and decor to that living room. Here I think I'm having some Redshift issues, so I was checking to see if there's a new version available. And one thing I kept running into is that with X particles, even though I had it cached, that first frame would often be blank until I moved forward one frame. And so eventually I put a hold on the playback of the cache, and so every frame is using the same cached frame, so I wouldn't have to frame forward one just to submit a render every time. So here I'm making little sparks, little embers coming off the torch to add to the fire and the smoke. And this kind of goes back to my earlier plan on making the smoke trail go from the living room door all the way to the torch. And again, I don't really get that really specific trail that I was going for at first, but I thought it'd be nice to add a little bit more ember stuff. Now here I noticed that the boy's jacket was really smooth. There's, nice wrinkles, but the fidelity of the wrinkles is kind of medium, not super sharp. So I found a wrinkle brush pack, like an alpha pack, and eventually I bring that into Substance and just paint a little bit of depth into that material to further enhance the wrinkles on the jacket. And in order to do this, I wanted the UVs to be, nicely laid out, because I think earlier I did some Polygon Reduction on this, so I think it might have messed up the UVs that were there. And already you can see how those little bits of wrinkles are adding a nice amount of detail without adding any more geometry. And now I'm trying to paint on some wet spots, because the boy just left his house, but it's raining enough where the jacket would already start to be getting a little bit wet. So now the jacket looks a lot more lived in, a lot more integrated into the scene with all that wetness. All right, now I think I'm thinking about adding some moss or some bits of growth to this foreground tree, because the branches of the tree look a little simple. And so here I made a rig that takes an alpha matte or like a texture, and based on that it traces it, adds some volume, and then slices it to give a little bit of padding, so automatically you get really nice cutouts of all these shapes without having to go in and manually add polygons and manually do all this. So it saves a lot of time, and once this rig is built out, I just have to import the texture, and then it'll automatically see the edges and just pop all those out. And once you make it editable, you just have all this really nice clean geometry. Well, it's not really clean, but it's super efficient because you don't have to manually model it. Now I just clone that onto the branches and called it good. And here I just found a simple model of a chair. I didn't feel like continuing to model every asset from scratch, so I just found a really simple chair to throw up on the roof. And at this point I'm getting really close to the end. You can see a lot of the changes I'm making are little changes or little props, things that have maybe already existed but now look a little different, or a little too bright or too dark or too prominent. Like adding these little lights in the background. Before that, a condo back in the background was pretty dark. You couldn't really tell what was going on, so just adding a little outside like security light helps bring it out. Yeah, for these windows, not all the windows were turned on, so some of them just have kind of a dark blinds background. So I added a little bit of noise in there to break up the flatness of it. And similarly to the rooms with the lights on but the blinds closed, is that they wouldn't have a perfect light cast. Like there'd be things in the room casting shadows or light bouncing off the walls a little bit. So just adding a few little shapes, eventually I'd kind of fake the shadows and make it look like there's more stuff in the room. So you can see in the top left of that render little dark spots showing up in the blinds where I'm throwing these objects. Because in reality, the room wouldn't be empty. There'd be a couch or the end of a bed or a dresser, maybe a lamp that's casting a shadow if the lamp's not turned on. And here I realized that there's a balcony in these condos, but there's no doorway to get out onto them. So I just extended the windows down a little bit and added a handle to convert the windows into nice, big open glass doors. And now I'm back working on the street. I had realized that the scale of the street felt really weird with that yellow stripe in the middle because it wasn't really the width of a 2-lane street. So by moving that stripe to the edge of the street, and then making it white, it makes it a little bit more realistic of a scale. And here I'm building a trash bag to populate the trash cans with, and maybe throw one in the street too, or on the sidewalk. And at first I manually modeled the general shape of it, and was trying to simulate that. But in the end, it was a lot more realistic to actually use the proper shape that a real garbage bag would be made out of, just 2 rectangular pieces glued together, and then, simulate that with a little bit of pressure inside to get the lumpiness to make it look like it's a little bit full. And to make it even more realistic, I imported this trash can, and so now when I simulate the bag, it should fall in the trash can and drape over it realistically. And this is handy because then when I make the second trash bag, that also drapes on top of the first one, and you just get this really nice interaction between the 2 objects. Unfortunately, because of the resolution of these bags, they weren't super duper high. The edges of the bags are very smooth. They don't have these kind of like hard edges like a normal trash bag would look. So if you see there, it looks almost like they're latex or like leather instead of this thin plastic. And I could have probably gone in and sculpted the edges and kind of manually made them sharper. But I think I'd go back and increase the resolution and keep simulating them until they get a little bit sharper. Yeah, I think that's what I'm doing here now, is trying to get those sharper, more jagged edges on the bags. And as with any simulation, it's a little bit tricky. You don't have full control, and so you're at the mercy of gravity and physics and the speed of the engine. And this is the version of Marvelous that is right before they added GPU simulation, and so my capabilities were a little bit limited to the CPU, and therefore it's tricky to really crank up the resolution of these. But even still, it works pretty good. Now I'm just tweaking little bits as I see them. The moss hanging from the trees was slanted a little bit too much, so I wanted to pull that back in. It is a windy day, but for some reason the moss just didn't feel right at that steep of an angle. And the moss is protected by the trees in the forest area, so there wouldn't be the full intensity of the wind hitting them. Now I'm finally getting to detailing the front corner of the scene where the garbage can is. My plan was to fully populate it with enough trash to show that, we're such a consumer society and we produce an immense amount of trash from all the deliveries that we get between Uber Eats and Amazon and just everything. And of course, because it's raining, I have to go in and manually, soak every object, make sure they're shiny, make sure the cardboard is soaked or the bag has, drippage and just overall wet soaked properties. And in Megascans, they have a handful of kind of garbage pieces, and they weren't exactly what I wanted, but this little takeout box was perfect for a small prop. And little by little, I just keep noticing small background assets that weren't fully textured, and so here I'm going in and getting the bus stop all finished. And because the text options in Substance are pretty limited, I had to hop over to Photoshop to create the text here. And this is the beauty of using layers, is I can hide the entire forest and everything renders way quicker when I'm either troubleshooting or just adjusting certain lights and certain elements that don't need the full forest to be previewed. Another cinema crash there. So at this point, I was still working at a slightly off 16:9 ratio. I was using the golden ratio, which is almost 16:9, but not exactly. And I realized that if I ever want to share this in like a Vimeo environment or on a television that's 16:9, that in the end, having it be exactly the golden ratio wasn't as important as it was to be able to fit it into just more screens and more of a common format. So there, when I was adjusting the camera angle, I think that's when I shifted the overall aspect ratio and resolution just slightly. I just keep finding little pieces that either don't have any texture on them or look too simple, like they're unfinished. So there I just added a little edge detail to the top of that roof piece. And so here I just blasted out every possible AOV just to see what I could get. I didn't really have too much of a plan for the post color work, other than just knowing that I wanted to have all the options available to me. So there I just skimmed through them real quick to see what I was actually going to use. And this part's tricky because I'm getting pretty close to the final render. I'm testing the noise levels, and the pieces of fog that I put in, those clouds, introduce a lot of noise. And what I should have done is gone through and manually set all the samples, but because this is just one frame and I could let it go overnight, I wasn't too concerned, or more so I was just lazy and threw samples at everything. So it took a few tries to find the right amount of samples to throw on it. And of course I paused for the actual rendering, so we didn't have to watch the whole process. So here you saw just now is going through Magic Bolt looks, seeing if there's a little color profile I could add on to give it a little bit more juice. And a lot of this process is just trial and error. I knew, a little bit of flare, a little bit of glint adds a nice touch, but it's good to be subtle. You don't want to blast the flares too aggressively and cover up all the work you've done. And it's tempting just to put a really heavy effect on it, but so much effort was put into, these last 100 or whatever hours that I don't want to fully crush all the blacks and lose all the detail in the shadows. So it is a battle of self-restraint, making sure you don't overpower the final color correct. And here, this one piece, I took some volumetric light from the volume pass and comped that on top of itself, and that really made that cave pop. Because before it was maybe a little too subtle, and now it just glows a lot more and demands your attention more than it did before. So now you're really starting to see the heroes that are the doorway, the torch with the boy, and the cave. Those three pieces are the main story, and everything that's outside of those pieces is just supplementary to the story. And I think here I realized there's a little difference in the lightness because of the bit depths that were being used. So now that I saved that frame out of After Effects, I brought it into Photoshop to do the final little touch-ups. There's a few spots that picked up light on the reflections, or there's a little bit of noise in the volume that I could easily just paint out little pieces of. Or if something looked too clean, I could just scratch it up really quick. And if you do enough work in 3D, this process is fairly easy, and it just adds a little bit of extra touch that would be too time-consuming in 3D to pull off. And here I'm painting out some noise. I ran the whole render through a denoiser and then manually painted right there. You can see the red is where I'm painting the denoise pass on top of itself, because there was a lot of noise in that section from the volume that was kind of back there. I think 2 volumes might have been overlapping, and so it was extra noisy right in that area. And I'm just painting out a few of the reflections. It was a little too uniform. And that's it. That's the final render. Thank you guys for listening. If you've made it this far, then you know exactly the process, and you know how fun and methodical it was, and sometimes frustrating. So I really appreciate it. Thank you guys.